Hello, friends. Today I'm in conversation with Nick Morrison. But before we start, a little preliminary note. I wanted to inform you that I'm going to slightly modify the name of the podcast because I found, to my utter dismay, that there are other podcasts of the same name. Of course, because it's the internet. And actually, I haven't checked all of them, but there was one of them that was quite interesting. So if you want to check it out. So yeah, I'm going to name the podcast probably XPol, so cross-pol with the letter X, only the 4 letters. And probably that should be enough. I'll probably also add my name to the title. So this way I'm sure that it will be the only one. Okay, so Nicholas Morrison is a French and American singer, multi-instrumentalist and educator. He's a lover of music in the broadest possible sense of the term, and he's also my teacher. Today I'm interviewing him for about 2 hours, and I must say that he has a lot of wisdom to share, and we've had an amazing conversation. We go into his past, we talk about the different musical traditions he's been in contact with throughout his life, and about the evolving interaction between music and culture at large. In the second part of the conversation, I'm asking him questions about his thoughts concerning student-teacher relationships, and we discuss the importance of these relationships and also the reasons why mentorship is as relevant as ever in the day and age of internet and YouTube. So here he is, Mr. Nick Morrison. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, Nick Morrison.
Hello, Baptiste.
Thank you for being here and accepting to be on part of the 4th episode of that podcast. I wanted to ask you a few questions and maybe start a little bit with your background, because you and me have met at BIM Berlin and you were one of my teachers there. And I'd like to ask you about your life and how you were led to BIM Berlin. How did it start for you? What is your musical parkour like?
Well, my musical parkour is a long and winding road that we'll see how much of that we cover over the course of this conversation. But maybe the most relevant thing to say about how I ended up at BIM Berlin was just that I studied music at New England Conservatory at age 27. I started getting a master's degree there, and when I finished at age 29, I really felt like I was at the beginning of my career as a musician, so to speak, and the option of leaving Boston, where I went to conservatory, and either going to New York or to Chicago. Chicago was where I'd been before, and that would have felt like going backwards. And going to New York, as I think people can imagine, when you're still just trying to find your foothold as a musician, these days, moving to New York is pretty daunting, pretty challenging. So because I have 2 passports, a French passport and a US passport, for me the option of moving to Europe was relatively doable, and not as challenging as it is for most Americans. And so I came to Berlin, and I just the getting the job at BIM was really just a right place at the right time thing of being the school had opened here a couple, like I think the year before, and I was invited to do some sub-teaching by someone I was playing in a band with, and they needed a guitar player different from Knox Chandler, and I have this master's degree. So I always say there are a lot of better guitar players in Berlin than me, but not all of them have a master's degree from a conservatory. So that's how I ended up teaching at BIM Berlin.
Okay, you started studying at New England Conservatory at 27, right? That's what you told me?
Yeah.
So did you get a master's degree there or also a bachelor's?
I just got a master's degree. So my undergraduate degree is in some kind of philosophy. from the University of Chicago. So to rewind just a little bit, then one can say that I grew up playing classical piano, and then was never going to go anywhere with that, and stopped at age 17 or 18 and began messing around with guitar while I was studying composition, still already in high school. And I moved to Chicago, and really I can mark the articulation point of me deciding to become a musician was when I went to the Velvet Lounge at age 20 and saw African American jazz, energy music, free jazz, whatever you want to call it. I was barely familiar with all this music to begin with, and then to see it live just changed my life at that moment. And so then I spent another 7 years in Chicago, sort of working towards this goal of being able to go get a master's degree, even though I didn't have a bachelor's in music.
What city did you grow up in before you moved to Chicago?
Yeah, so I grew up really in between the U.S. and France. Was born in Paris, moved back to the U.S., moved back to Paris, and grew up mostly in Paris. And then came to the U.S. again when I was 16, and finished high school there, and then went to Chicago to study there.
So you saw that gig or these gigs and you got into free jazz?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say about the Velvet Lounge is that it's closed now, but it was the club. It was the home base of the AACM, which is the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which is basically a predominantly African American musicians organization based in Chicago, founded I believe in the mid 60s, and Anthony Braxton and Roscoe Mitchell and the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and a lot of important musicians from the avant-garde or progressive jazz music scene in Chicago and in Minneapolis and in the Midwest were associated with this collective. And so by the time I got to the Velvet Lounge in 2004 or something like that, this had been there for 40 years or something like that. And the musicians that I saw playing there were there was one musician in particular, a drummer named Vincent Davis, who had a band with Edward Wilkerson, who's still a great saxophone player working in Chicago, and they would play every Thursday. And the band was Vincent and Ed, and at first it was Malachi Favors, who had been the bass player for the Art Ensemble, and then he died and was replaced by a younger guy, and sometimes there was a guitar player, and sometimes there was a piano player, and sometimes there were other guests. But this core trio or duo of Vincent Davis and Ed played every Thursday, and I went to see them almost every Thursday for like 2 years. So I think I saw probably about 70 gigs of this band, and it was an education in so many ways, partially because that's one of the things about the old era of jazz music and music in a lot of places was that of course, bands have always traveled and musicians have always had to travel. But one thing that used to happen more was that people had a regular standing gig, or jazz bands would play for 3 weeks, 5 nights a week, or for 6 weeks, 5 nights a week in one place. I believe Coltrane played with Monk 5 nights a week for almost 6 months during his year-long tenure with the Thelonious Monk Band. So when one thinks about the kind of education that you can have learning from an older musician on stage, there's something different from taking a prepared show and going around from city to city and playing the same show in a different place for different people, and playing every night in the same city, often for maybe not the same audience, but Vincent knew, he saw us coming every time.
Yeah,
right?
It's like a continuing story.
There was a continuing story, and they were pressured for the music to evolve, and we watched the music evolve, and we watched there be good nights, and we watched there be bad nights, and we watched there be nights where it's something you thought you had seen everything these musicians could do, and then something else would happen, and you would start to also learn their tricks a little bit, like how, when they were struggling or when things weren't working, what they would sort of fall back on, all these strategies that they had to keep creating, and that I think that's a common thread that runs through a lot of different, I guess what we would call different kinds of folkloric music, where you're not playing as much of a fixed piece, or even if you're playing a piece, there's some sort of pressure to make it different every night. And this idea of playing is quite far removed from the way a lot of music gets made now, which is that a song gets written maybe in the studio or for the studio, or it gets written by being produced, and then the live act becomes a process of finding a way to deliver that recorded composition live. This is actually much more similar to classical music, right? To the idea of the composer having creating something in his head and writing it all out, and then there can be variations in interpretation somehow, but there's some very fixed starting point. And this is you can listen to jazz on record and have one idea of it, right? And if you're a real nerd, you can go and listen to Charlie Parker play the same song on all the different recordings and try to figure out what was improvised and what was not. But I just feel very privileged and blessed to have seen that caliber of musicians of that level playing so many times, and that was a very formative experience for me.
Yeah, because if I understand correctly, the way you learned is more of a subtractive way of learning, in the sense that you were seeing the same show over and over, but which was always slightly different, and so you got to see what was the same and what was changing, and sometimes working and sometimes not working, and through this prism maybe you could infer the way they were going about it, thinking about it, developing stories and maybe musical private jokes. And how do you feel that has an impact on the musician you are today, and what are we missing in general because of that change in the musical landscape?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's we can look up afterwards who the author of the book on Coltrane is that I'm thinking about right now, who points out that when trying to evaluate the legacy of Coltrane and why we haven't had figures of that stature since then, why there's been sort of there's been a feeling generally that no jazz band has ever been able to quite get back to this feeling that bands like the Coltrane Band or the Miles Davis Band or many bands in the 60s and 70s had. I think this is, he points out that this is a big part of it. It's just the absence of a regular gig or steady work in a consistent environment. Because again, being on the road is very stressful for musicians. It takes an incredibly disciplined musician to travel to a different city, play a gig, go back to a hotel, wake up the next morning, travel again. You don't have time to practice. You don't have time to sort of live in any way beyond being a traveler and then doing this thing every night. And to keep growing and to keep improvising or keep developing in that context is very, very difficult. And so those bands that could play every night, they would rehearse during the day, or they would not, or they would just hang out, but they just had more time outside of the playing to develop what they were doing. And again, playing in the same place or the same environment every night enables a different kind of growth. And so I think what that taught me, or the lesson that I drew from that, is to not be afraid to really take time with material that I'm developing. If I can't perform as often as I'd like, or if I can't get my band out in front of an audience as often as I would like, I can still resist a little bit the temptation to put out another album or write new songs or keep creating new things, and try to stick with this more slow-moving process of developing material. And this is, there are a lot of different ways to do this, but that's what I got to witness, was musicians developing their material somehow.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, at least from my perspective, how the zeitgeist and the technological situation and innovations tend to shape completely the kind of music that we have at hand. And I'd like to know maybe what you think about what we could call a sleight of hand that happened when the jazz that you're describing was maybe more and more funneled to the universities, and it's still jazz, we call it jazz, but the way it started is very different, because before it was more like try to copy and imitate and spend a lot of time on the same songs with like the same musicians in different contexts. And now it is maybe much more of an academic pursuit, not always, of course. But yeah, I would like to have your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's right, what you said, that there've been all of the pressures that we can imagine come with institutionalizing something and trying to shape it for a curriculum and make it into something that can be sold to students. Of course, it changes the content and the process a lot. My teachers at the conservatory were people who had basically firsthand experience of the older generation in one way or another. And they were constantly sort of stressing to us that there, that there is no right way, and that to do these things, and that the jazz musicians themselves, Coltrane himself would have said, "I don't like this word jazz." Right? It's become an idea to keep musicians in a box, or market them, or push them in one direction or another, to try and make money by having an audience and a product that you can sell, that you can describe in a certain way. And jazz musicians never thought of what they were doing in that way. On the contrary, the earliest musicians were just playing the music that they knew and creating new music as they went along, and they were making it all up. they were there was of course an idea of precedent and tradition that was already operating, but it was not written down in books. There was no real book. There was no technique books on which licks to practice. No, there were the people. It was a living tradition, and it's so important to remember that the people who invented bebop, a lot of them did not read music, or did not have this. It's not that they didn't have theory or didn't have a way of analyzing it, but it was more orally based than based on things being written out.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it feels like there is some kind of an optical illusion here. Earlier today, before the talk, we were talking about retrofuturism and how Star Wars today looks retrofuturistic, but back in the day, in 1979, when it first came out, it looked like the future. And in the same way, it seems to me like the bebop you're describing now seems to us to fit into a neat little category. But at the time, these guys were on the edge, and they probably were not feeling like they were creating something in a specific vein, but more that they were exploring a domain in all different possible directions.
The spirit of exploration is a really it's something that really needs to be distinguished from the idea of style or genre or brand or any of these other things, because I feel like that's a big. If you're forming a band now, there's a lot of sort of question of like, okay, well, what are we? There's a pressure right away somehow to you need to make a website or a Facebook page, or you need to create a video, or there's this sort of pressure to create a product. Right away, and that this somehow then starts to fix a certain identity, and this is how we are all taught to think, to the extent that we ingest ideas about how to succeed as musicians. Related to this is the idea of professionalism, right? That there's a professional way to play an R&B bass line, and there's a professional. You can be a professional reggae guitar player, or a professional this or a professional that, and it means that you know the rules and the stylistic ideas involved around playing a certain style of music. And again, it's not that you wouldn't have gotten thrown off the stage or have a cymbal thrown at you, as Charlie Parker did, I believe, for playing something wrong or that doesn't fit.
Was it Charles Mingus? Charles Mingus, I think, threw a cymbal at someone and broke his teeth or something.
We need to check that. Neither of us are professional jazz historians. But somehow the things were more. Because you were not operating on so many levels of representation, if we can say it that way, because you were not thinking about a photo for your cover and how you were going to present this on the internet and what the first record was going to be, because your first question was just to play music for people. And if it felt good, it felt good, and you got a gig. Of course, there were people back then sort of policing what was blues and what was rhythm, and there was the race issues about where you could play. It was not to say that it was easy, but there was. It seems that there was less, a little bit less pressure to define yourself quite so quickly or quite so early, and more of, like you said, more of just this. What was valued was also a sense, especially amongst musicians, this spirit of exploration was what was valued. And so that's why in the history of jazz, they always talk about the importance of the jam sessions, right? Because the musicians from the big bands, from Duke Ellington's band or from Count Basie's band, all these different famous big bands that were playing for the big dances. They were the dance bands of the time in New York or Boston or Philadelphia or wherever. They would finish playing their dance gigs for the dancers at 1 or 2 in the morning, and then they would go to the Hara, to the Miltz or wherever. I can't think of the famous one in Harlem right now. And there they would just really play for one another. And there somehow the goal was to surprise one another, right? And the audience that was there was also an audience of regulars and musicians who were not going to be satisfied by professional,ism. You know, they were
modern day professionalism.
They were there to be surprised. And I think you can hear that in those recordings. That when you can hear the audience and the other musicians when somebody's taking a risk or is somehow on the edge of what they can do. There's an energy and excitement in the room that that's different.
Do you feel like, because from what I understand, there has been a shift in what you're describing. There has been a shift between, on the one hand, the music per se and the packaging of the music and the way we package it. And it seems to me like this has to do with the recording, because nowadays when we think about music, the first thing that comes to mind for people is probably recording, whether it's on a CD, on a vinyl, or on Spotify or whatever platform. And I was wondering if you have thoughts about how this recording phenomenon has completely changed the musical landscape.
You know, it's interesting because along with the rise of recordings, one has to acknowledge that there is, I think, more money being made by large festival events than ever in the past as well. So it's hard to disentangle these things, and I can only speak as a foot soldier, so to speak. I'm not an insider within the industry by any means. I don't know what the numbers look like per se, but it is. I think what you say about people identifying the music with recordings is correct. As recordings have become more important, it's a way to reach more and more people with your music, right? So it's a way to create a mass marketable product. And along with this technology for creating recordings, the other thing that developed basically in parallel is sound amplification technology to project sound over a larger and larger space to a larger and larger group of people. And when you get to the very, very largest concerts, of course, something you have now, which you didn't have in the past, of course, was also just the extent of the visual show that is put in place now, which includes massive video screens so that you too can, bring around this, whether they have the claw that took 40 trucks to move this massive stage. The cost of this tour that they had was the equivalent of sending a spaceship to Mars and back, right? Because they had this massive four-cornered claw so that the audience could be all around them, and that the music could reach the maximum number of people while still providing some sort of sense of being there. And so that's what I mean. I think in general we've seen music both live and on recording the most, there's been a pressure or a pushing it towards towards this mass, just like the hamburger, just like the McDonald's hamburger, towards something that can be consumed on a mass scale. And that's, of course, that has a lot of different ramifications for the musicians and for the music itself, right? You can't. It doesn't matter how good amplification gets. Certain kinds of playing or certain kinds of subtleties or certain kinds of things don't work if you're trying to amplify them for 100,000 people.
Yeah. So you're saying, in a way, if I understand correctly, that this is the way the mass market or the necessity for mass marketability has shaped the music. But what I was maybe alluding to is the fact that it seems to me that recordings have become prescriptive rather than descriptive. So they were supposed to be a retranscription of reality, but then now it's more of a guidelines that you have to follow. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and I mean, I think, yeah, exactly. And I think, somebody like the Beatles or Zeppelin were loved making records and had a great time in the studio exploring what they could do there. And then when they played live, it was still they were still somehow connected to this slightly older idea of how you're supposed to play together, and the joy that comes from having this edge in the music where it's not 100% prescribed. They're not they don't have sample triggers and in-ear monitors and all these things to try and create exactly the record sound, and that was never the goal. But yeah, exactly, that there's part of the reason it's become prescriptive, like I think is part of the reason it's become prescriptive is that there's also this pressure live to be able to deliver a consistent experience for as large a group of people as possible. So that's why I think the recording aspect and this sense that you're playing for different audiences all the time and you don't have a regular gig anymore, and the sense that you need to be able to play for as many people as possible and have it be as sonically consistent as possible for a large group of people, have all those three aspects have all conspired together to really change the way that musicians think about what they're trying to do when they play live. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the book Noises by Jacques Attali, who is a thinker that, by the way, I don't really like in other regards, but this book is really interesting. It was recommended to me by Chad Matheny.
Yeah.
And actually, it's like more of a philosophy book. And the thesis in this book is that the changes in the music industry mirror the changes in society with a little bit of advance. So they are kind of harbingers of what's gonna happen in society. And a lot of people are describing our Western societies are becoming more and more individualistic, and for a couple of years already, there's been a surge in individual musicians and people that have a single name that don't really play with bands anymore, but also with technology, production, electronic music, and etc. And I wanted to have your thoughts on this and about the difference between being a single musician, individual musician, and playing in a band.
It's a big question. There's a lot to say. I've noticed it as well. I like this idea from Attali about music as a harbinger. The pressure to so if we say that somehow this idea of individualism is something that needs to be unpacked, right? It's a complex concept somehow, but leaving that aside for just a second, one can say that yes, the new platforms and new cultural spirit or ethos of everybody having the right to express themselves, and everyone has something to say. Everybody should have a voice. There are probably a lot of positive aspects to this, right? Maybe the negative aspect is that it encourages everyone to seek to be their own, to express their own identity, which there are two parts of that. One, we are all copies of one another to some extent, right? Everybody living in a certain era is going to be influenced by certain things, and there's a question about how much of this is sort of variations on the same, this individualism, right? The other aspect is just that if we're all trying to express our own voice, then how do we come together to do something collective, right? And in the past, there was a very imperfect and very problematic process that excluded women and minorities, and also, I'm not trying to glorify the past by any means, but music in the past, there was somehow some musicians felt themselves, I think, more to be at the intersection between a collective processes and individual processes, and there was a sense that try making a bunch of people dance alone with an acoustic guitar, right? It's not so easy. It works a lot better if you've got a fiddle and a banjo there with you, right? So there was a certain pressure just in terms of making something richer, sonically, or more powerful, to collaborating with other people. There was also this sense of a way of, there were techniques and technologies for making the music work that needed to be learned and passed down collectively. So if you were a young guitar player living somewhere 100 years ago, there was no YouTube there was no way to learn other than by playing with other musicians, and there was no way to gain sort of the knowledge of how to make the music work. Also on the audience, in terms of creating a good show or connecting with the audience, the stagecraft, all this stuff was this experience had to be acquired firsthand, and in acquiring this experience firsthand, you were participating in the conservation of the music that had come before, right? You couldn't go out and get a gig playing by yourself from the beginning, or you couldn't create music and put it up on SoundCloud and gain a following that way. You had to go and play music with other people, and then you learned other people's songs. And it was very common all the way up until the 60s and 70s for established artists spent a lot of time learning other people's music. They had learned it growing up, and there was not this pressure to express always themselves. Everybody, Aretha Franklin covered the Beatles and all sorts of people, right? And this was again, another piece of this, to relate it back to the whole economic aspect of the culture, is copyright law.
Yeah, I was gonna say this exactly. Yeah.
Right, and so all of us now as creators feel like the only way that we can potentially make a living is to make sure that we, claim the 10% credit for that bridge on that person's song, or better yet, write the whole song ourselves, right? Yeah. And there's much less of an incentive. Back in the day, if there was a great song that had been made, you could make a lot of money and tour based on a great cover of that song, right? in an interesting way, we're seeing that come around again now somehow with the remixes thing. But again, it's now been transformed. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question about this thing about individualism. But I do think that is a big part of it. Is this the technology now makes it possible for a musician to from his or her bedroom, without coming into only by coming into contact with music through recordings. There are the tutorials. There's a drummer in Logic who you can tell him to play different beats.
There's a bunch of them, like Jake who plays funk, and Miranda who plays this, and
and so you can actually get quite a long way in terms of creating something that's nominally yours, right? Just the way you can use filters on Instagram to create individualistic looking photos without actually learning the things about photography you would have needed to know to be a Man Ray in the past, right? I think the same thing happens now, where we have the technology to give us sort of the illusion that we're creating something individualistic, whereas in fact, because we don't go through this exploratory process with other people as much, we end up producing a lot of very same sounding music.
Yeah, what you're saying is really interesting, and I feel like in a sense there is a divide between me and you, in the sense that you are a modern musician, but in many ways I'm a postmodern musician, because I'm like a YouTube, internet taught musician, and I really like the paradox that you seem to be outlining, that in a society where we are all with not as much limitations, you're able to create a show all by yourself, that because you're not limited by instrumentations or the acoustic and physical limits of one specific instruments. But yeah, there is this paradox that paradoxically we're all different in the same way, whereas before, as a band was a means sometimes to transcend this and to create something different together.
Yeah, and even if you were playing not your song, right?
Yeah.
Even if you were playing someone else's song, or a standard in the case of jazz, this act of being together and combining your energies produced a different kind of individuality.
Yeah. But about that, there is a documentary, I don't know if you heard about it, about copyright law and how it completely changed music and hip-hop especially. I don't know if you heard about that. For example, the fact that hip-hop was born on block parties in America, and so people would use bits and pieces of like funk tracks and disco tracks and remix them all together, but it proved to be a legal nightmare. So then the sampling scene became, instead of sampling 20 songs in one new remix, you would sample 3 and get the rights for this.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of on how the legal situation and paradigm completely shaped the music. And I don't know if you know this lawyer, Larry. I don't have his name anymore, but he's a super famous lawyer, and he gave a TED talk. I think about 10 years ago, when he predicted memes and stuff like that, and that whole remix scene. And we are in a weird situation, because on the one hand, it's never been easier to be in a meme making, cross-pollinating creation of things, of new artistic artifacts that are standing on the shoulders of giants. And on the other hand, it doesn't fit with the legal paradigm in which we are. So there is this like weird dissonance and distortion that you can really see through, for example, the whole downloading problems that we had in the past few years. And
yeah, and I don't have much expertise in that area. So I mean, I think the only thing I can add to that is just I myself have often thought that I would be in a different era. I would have been probably more satisfied with the role of interpreter, or uh, uh, by nature, I'm a collaborator, and I would have been, I probably constitutionally would have been thrilled just to be interpreting other people's music and expressing myself and my individuality through my guitar playing and through my reinterpretations of other people's material. For me, one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, hands down, is Nina Simone, because of how powerful her reinterpretations are. They're often better than her original material, which is also, a lot of it is great, but she put such a strong stamp she transformed it to the point of being unrecognizable sometimes, or you couldn't imagine anybody else singing this, or like what the original version could have been. And that's just as powerful to me, a form of artistry, just as much as expressed, or the audience is just as moved by that as by watching somebody sing something they've created completely themselves. I feel like it's a compromise that I've sort of made with this moment, to feel like, well, it's somehow as a format for me to sing and play songs on the guitar. This is something I enjoy. In order to have a career doing this, I need to write my own songs, and that feels like my compromise with this moment that we're in somehow.
Yeah, it feels to me like we're losing this idea of a standard.
Absolutely. I mean, people do. There's still, there's a hit song that comes out every year that gets remixed a bunch of times, and then it gets swept away by the next stuff. And this can all sound incredibly depressing and incredibly sort of atavistic. And I want to be sure to say that I don't feel like I can really pass judgment completely on the present moment, because again, one of the positive aspects of this democratization of the means of production and means of expression for music is that anybody can make a recording, and anybody, and the hip hop music itself is the perfect example of like people who would have not had a voice, or who would have never gotten into the recording studio, making something really, really powerful and beautiful, without the proper musical training, and without having gone through the bands that they were, without all this stuff. So it's really hard. It's really hard to
parse the pros and the cons.
The pros and the cons.
But it's just, we are kind of not saying that the future is dark, but just saying that there are pros and cons to everything, and that in some ways there are some things that, despite all the advantages that we now have and all the progress that has been made, some things are lost.
Absolutely, tremendous things are being lost, and I think it's also fair to ask whether people who feel like the best days in terms of certain heights of virtuosic musical achievement, that those days are behind us. I think that could be true, I mean, I look at Indian classical music, for example, which really is probably, to me, the deepest of all of the musical traditions, probably outside of Western classical music, and I'd say jazz is the closest competition. Indian classical music really comes from a completely patriarchal kind of social environment, right, where a master musician is waited upon by his family and by his students, and the students come for 10 years to study under this guru, and of course the guru doesn't clean or cook or do anything. The guru meditates and develops the ability to play 64th notes at I don't know how many BPM, and this is a miracle of human ability that this music was created, but the social conditions necessary for its creation are pretty problematic. And I think you can look at orchestras, you can look at a lot of things in the past in that way, making pressuring your child to start playing the violin at age 3 is
the Suzuki method
is also a pretty ethically. It's not an ethically unambiguous thing to do, and I would be curious now to meet the parents who are still trying to put their children through that kind of an education, because it's making a huge life decision for your child before they have any kind of adult consciousness to choose their own, to make choices themselves. So that we have some kinds of artistic achievements that rest on ethically dubious or ambiguous situations is, I think, something we have to be honest about.
It's
right?
Interesting, yeah.
When
tiger parenting.
Yeah, and I mean,
but also Michael Jackson would be an example of that, right?
Of course, exactly.
Yeah,
and
his family and
the other ethically ambiguous context that created really transcendently beautiful music was, of course, slavery and the way that African Americans were treated. One can have this conversation about drug abuse as well, whether all the people, the Billie Holidays and the Charlie Parkers and all the people who were dead by the time they were 40 something, whether this suffering that they had, that then was sort of the drugs that they took, sort of made it possible for them to keep creating while living with this pain, and that then this whole complex of pain is what gets expressed through the music. I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether, on balance, we would be better off having fewer drug addicts and maybe music that is, it's going to be different, and I that's what I try to embrace as my philosophy of the future. We probably won't have a Coltrane. We won't have a Coltrane again. We won't have a Ravi Shankar again. We're gonna have something else. It's gonna be different.
So, I have kind of a loaded question I want to ask you. A question about teachers, because I know that you had teachers back in Boston that you still refer to and that occupy a big part in what you are now teaching. Like, for example, Jerry Leake and the idea of harmonic time, or Rand Blake and stuff like that. And I would like to ask you, maybe starting more in general with your ideas about what a relationship between a student and a teacher should be like or could be like, and the difference between teaching groups and teaching single students.
I mean, I think whether you're teaching in a group or part of a group of students or not, there's always the chance in a relationship with a teacher that that there's some sort of resonance that develops. And I was lucky that sort of the format of the England Conservatory where I studied, you had the sort of opportunity to have a not just 1 20-minute session, but study 7 hours over the course of a term with basically any faculty member in the whole school. You would, as a student in contemporary improvisation, I would have had trouble getting into the star cello player's studio or something, right? But hypothetically, there was nothing to stop me from going and studying with the bebop saxophone players or anybody, right? And so what I was able to do was to really spend one-on-one time with the teachers that I connected with the most, first in a group situation. And this was true back in Chicago as well, that I took some one-on-one guitar lessons from teachers that I thought could teach me something technically about guitar, even if I didn't like their music very much. And then I spent countless hours with Vincent Davis, who was a drummer, at his house, because I felt such a connection to him. So whether it's teaching in groups or whether it's teaching individually, I think every student has the task to identify teachers who have something more than just technical information to offer to them, right? So, because every teacher has a lot of technical information that they can impart, better or not so well. But regardless of how well they can impart that technical information, there's something in their personality or in their spirit or in their way of relating to music I guess I can try to put it into words, but I don't think I'm going to succeed completely, my teacher Hank Isnetsky, who, if I were to describe in words what he taught me, it was, some stuff about ear training and how to listen to music and how to he was a klezmer piano player who didn't, there was nothing in particular about the style of music that he played or anything that he did that was particularly related to what I wanted to do. But he just had a way of getting inside the spirit of whatever music. He was very articulate about this idea of ear training and internalizing music, sort of like Rand Blake. But he also had this he had this really contagious enthusiasm for whatever he was listening to, that when I look at it now, it's quite obvious it's not so different. It's just not so different from mine, right? And so spending time with him was a way of sort of time traveling a little bit with myself, like being around someone who I could imagine having been myself at his age in the different places that he had been, right? Like what did someone who was like me learn in New York in the 70s, right? Which I can't go back to New York in the 70s, but here is someone who was in New York in the 70s who's very similar temperament to me, So what can I get from him in that way? The other huge influence on me that we haven't brought up is this guitar player Joe Morris, who also everything he taught me could in one sense be expressed in just a few sentences, but the thing that I learned the most from him over and over again through his stories was his story was a certain stubbornness about one's musical goals. He was a high school dropout who started playing guitar quite late and didn't achieve professional recognition until his late 30s, right? And he spent years depressed, not feeling very much on the outside of music, developing his totally individual style of guitar playing that nobody 90% of people cannot listen to the way Joe Morris plays guitar, and then he's now made he's probably coming close to 200 recordings now. It's like he really, at some point, it clicked. And that was
the critical mass, or
and that just being around him, he would just say over and over, give yourself permission. Give yourself permission to fail. Give yourself permission to be yourself. Don't try to do something that you don't really want to do from a place deep inside. And that I studied with him for a whole year meant that I could absorb that lesson sort of over and over again on a deeper level, because you can absorb any number of things intellectually. Like I can say, I give myself permission. But it took sitting there with Joe Morris, who is a master guitar player, just being like, okay, let's play, and we would just play and improvise together, two guitars. I'm feeling like a child across from him so often, but just this doing it over and over again, he often didn't say very much after I played, He wouldn't say, oh, great job. I mean, sometimes I did something good and he would say, but often it was like, we're both tired, or he's maybe not in a good mood, or I'm off my ball, but just that repetition of being around one another allowed for some other kind of energy transfer that goes beyond anything technical any technical information that a teacher can give.
So there is something to be said for these long cuts as opposed to shortcuts, and it's really funny.
Shortcuts to cut you off in general, like the shortcut thing is such a plague now, right? It's what every YouTube video is promising you is 10 ways to improve your life, or 4 tricks to make your guitar solos better, or the best Indian curry in 15 minutes, and it's like the slow way is it's not about it. Again, it's not, you can't compare apples to oranges. There's not
so to make a metaphor based on something that we both really like, there is something to be said for the slow percolating of ideas.
Exactly.
I also wanted to react on something that you said that I thought was really funny and interesting, because when you mentioned Henk Snetsky, I feel like these ideas of listening, and these simple ideas but that are a bit hard to articulate and that you have to understand, are what you are teaching me. That's what you are teaching me. And now you're crediting parts of this to Henk Snetsky. Reading Primacy of the Ear, that was written by Rand Blake. There is a part in there where Henk Snetsky is like a testimony, and he says how much the approach of Rand Blake changed the way he sees music.
Yeah.
And Rand Blake himself, in the acknowledgements, says about Gunther Schuller.
Gunther Schuller,
exactly.
Yeah.
Which is pretty crazy. So now I have to read Gunther Schuller's book and see what he has to say about that. But there seems to be some kind of a lineage of ideas there that is very interesting.
To return to this question of individualism and how this relates to that, to just be incredibly cynical and like harsh about it for just one moment. And I can say this because I was there, when I was 20 years old, my knowledge, like if we take a snapshot of me just before I went to the Velvet Lounge, right? My musical world at that point had basically been informed by, I mean, my mother was listening to sort of the modern minimalists like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, as well as some Baroque music and some opera music, and she had sort of eclectic concert music, classical music taste. So there was some of that in the background, and there were records from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, etc., sort of in the house as well. But basically, all of my favorite music, if I think about it at that time, what was important to me was all, basically stuff that had come to me through MTV or through my friends. And because the message of this music, Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins sings, "Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage." You know, the sort of primal, angry scream of every teenager, and he gets hugely famous doing this. And I remember listening to music at that time and connecting so strongly with these emotions, basically youth cultural emotions, expressed with all of the rawness of youth. And it's not that there's nothing positive about that music, but one of the things that it did to me at that time was make me feel like I had something also very important to say, that needed to be said right at that moment, right? That needed to be let out right now. And I was incredibly focused in my first band that I had when I was 19 with my best friends in college. We had the classic big heads, you know, of people of that age. Just in our minds, we were one record or hit song away from being the next Radiohead, you know, and we behaved that way, and we talked about the band incessantly in this way, and I think it's very important to note that this was the moment before I had met all of these teachers, right? This was the moment where my teachers, so to speak, were these really commodified representations of these bands. It's worth noting this was in a time where I didn't even, there wasn't, you know, it was all very mysterious at that time still, because this is basically pre-internet. I mean, 2000. There was, I would only see videos of these bands occasionally. I saw the Smashing Pumpkins live once, you know, on a big stage, and they were completely romantic, mystical figures to me. And in one sense, all that I learned from them was just this very sort of narcissistic adolescent energy that they were all projecting, right? There's not any discernible connection to tradition in their music. A lot of the grunge bands or alternative rock bands from the 90s were also, I believe, were also mainly influenced by other bands from the last 10 years, right? They were coming from really this narrow context of youth culture in conversation with itself, which is already very different from the 60s, where the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin made pop music out of their relationship with the blues and with American folk music. And they were listening to a lot of different things. I definitely was not listening to those different things. I was listening to the Smashing Pumpkins and Radiohead and wanted to make my music a continuation of that, which is just very, very, very shallow roots to have, you know? And it was only once I, you know, dipped my foot into this river of musical energy that was flowing through the Velvet Lounge, and sort of right away felt that this was something much, much deeper and richer, that I started looking for teachers, and not just believing that I already had in myself everything that I needed to go out and take on the world, which is a totally normal adolescent belief in one sense, right?
Yeah, and it seems like this is only accelerating and accelerating, because you said that for the grunge era it was 10 years before, but now it seems to be 6 months.
And of course, what happened to us was that we couldn't. This was still pre SoundCloud. There was like we got our MySpace profile up, but it was still before you could really self-release, right? It was before we did self-release. We printed some things by hand, right? But it was before you could sort of hope to become a YouTube celebrity overnight with a video that you'd made in your bedroom, right? And this is what you said. Everything is just accelerated, and this fantasy of bursting onto the music scene or any creative scene without needing to go through any kind of process of deepening your craft or becoming more connected to some kind of tradition or some sort of way of working.
Yeah, Ausbildung,
Yeah.
basically.
And it's hard to square this with that there have always, of course, there's always been outsider art. There's always been naive art. There's always been people who have expressed themselves on the outside of whatever establishment, or who have made very beautiful or very emotionally powerful work with very primitive or technically or very simple kinds of things. So it's not that this graph has more than one axis on it.
Yeah, it's a landscape. It's like
Yeah.
but we are kind of trying to navigate at the moment an age-old problem, which is the problem that you have when you're trying to create any medical test, which is the problem of false positives versus false negatives, in the sense that before we had barriers to entry that were really high, and maybe we surely missed on a lot because of the barriers to entry, but at the same time that was also a gauge of quality, and now like the barriers to entry are close to non-existent, but there is no nuance anymore, and there is so much information that in many ways the noise, of course it's just a way of talking, but the noise is crowding out what maybe is more culturally significant, to the point where it becomes a needle in a haystack. So yeah, I don't know how to think about that. That is really a disease of modernity. Obesity and extreme information, no time to digest it. Yeah.
Yeah, the obesity metaphor is actually a good one, because we are maybe all of us becoming somehow mentally obese, like mentally saturated to the point where we are stressed, we can't process or can't digest properly anymore all this new information. I really think my personal belief is that part of the solution to all of these things is the idea of local everything, right? Local food, local culture, local community, and somehow I don't know what it's going to look like. This synthesis that can occur, that hopefully will occur, or won't, but that could occur between a global connected world, where nonetheless activity returns to being on a more local scale, and I think there are a lot of examples of this and a lot of precedents for this. I went to see Thes Ullmann just a couple nights ago, and he's a funny musician because he's quite a big star in Germany, but because he's playing Deutsche Rock, basically, German rock music. He doesn't tour outside of Germany or Austria, and I think he makes a pretty good living, just doing those two areas, and he doesn't have the possibility really of aspiring to anything more than that, right? Because of the nature of the music that he's making, right? But I think this old era of needing to travel all over the world in order to find an audience for your music, at least for live musicians, has to somehow change, you know. I would love to see a return somehow to this idea of the juke joint or the club with the jam session and the regular stuff. And you see hints of that in cities like Berlin. It's not that people aren't trying. And it can be that we reach a point of fatigue or saturation where we start to tune out a little bit more, too much information coming from too many other places, and just like people are happy to return now to having a garden in their neighborhood rather than getting their food from Brazil. It's not impossible to imagine a time where people will start to see the value again in supporting in more music based from right around where they are. And this can create then a new kind of diversity, actually, right? Because then you have to work more with the constraints of whatever people, whatever musicians. You can't dream of like, oh, if only I was in New York and had Questlove as my drummer, then I could make the music that I really want, you know?
Are you familiar with Brian Eno's idea of Scenius?
I'm familiar with Brian Eno, but not with his idea of Scenius.
First of all, I must say that Brian Eno has many interesting ideas. I did not know, but he's really a thoughtful musician.
Yes.
And I mean, of course, there are the oblique strategies that are pretty famous among musicians.
Yeah.
But he also coined this term of Scenius, and he was taking issue with the idea of genius. And he was saying like all the big revolutions in music in the past were created by scenes, musical scenes, tiny ecosystems that were self-reliant, like what you were talking about, the Duke Ellington joint, right, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the punk rock scene in Camden, or I mean, you name it, the thrash Bay Area and
Any
so I was wondering what you think about this idea of Scenius as opposed to a lonesome genius that just.
Yeah, it corroborates what I was saying also. In the New York Times music critic's book about Coltrane, that's also his answer to the genius of Coltrane is you have to let go of this idea of Coltrane the genius. Coltrane was surrounded by geniuses and was able to synthesize everything that was around him because he was at the right place at the right time in this environment that was so fertile, and you know, the genius of his best music comes very much from his band as well, you know, and that he was able to find those guys and migrate between the Miles Davis band and the Thelonious Monk band and do all these different things that he did. That was what made him the person that he was the scene, as much as his own. Again, the legend of the spiritual artist, you know, in his attic writing a love supreme and coming down like Moses from the mountain is of course it's there is an individual element always in creation. There is a moment where an individual channels whatever is going on around him, and this the genius of it is that it was that person in that time channeling those things in that way, right? And it bears that mark of his personality somehow, that all those things came out, his or her personality, that they came out in that way. But you can't, nothing is created from nothing.
Yeah, it's sort of a fundamental attribution error.
Yeah.
In if you know what I mean. And it's kind of a Hollywoodian bias where movies are also limited in structure and they can only be 2 hours long. Right. Hollywoodian movies, and that's why we have to resort to stock characters.
Yeah.
And to this idea of the underdog that somehow, against all odds, makes it to the top, and that. And maybe it also relates to this idea. I mean, many musicians I talk to are pretty insecure about their art and feel like they are kind of cheating and they don't deserve it because they are very aware of the fact that they are standing on the shoulders of giants when they don't feel like they're actively stealing.
Right. And if they don't feel that way, it's because they are not aware, right? And this is what I mean about now everyone can express themselves with the same 3 chords and the same 5-note melody and the same lyrics, variations on the same lyrical themes with the same drum sounds, right? Everyone is refracting the world around them, and it's at the lowest levels. It's people may say that they don't. Yeah, I don't know. You may not be aware of which song you've stolen from, because you can't even hear yet that you just took these chords or that you just borrowed this melody, because you're not aware enough yet. But that's absolutely what's going on, and that doesn't. In one sense, there's nothing wrong with that, right? In one sense, that's what music has always been about, right? Is taking materials, and it's also, music is something that's happening in time. When you fix it on a recording, you make some sort of object, some sort of sound sculpture. But what makes a musical performance unique is that it happened on that day, in that place, in that room, in front of those people. Whatever happened in the news that day, whatever happened in those people's lives that day, all of that is in the room somehow in that moment. And that's part of what makes every performance different, right? And to put on ourselves this burden that a song that we create should express our individuality, and if we discover that the melody resembles some other melody, or that the chord sequence resemble, this is madness. To make a fetish out of originality.
That makes total sense
in this way.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
This is blinding ourselves to the Scenius aspect of culture.
And it's a form of hubris.
It's a form of hubris, and it's connected to this copyright nonsense, right? It's connected to this idea that it can only be sold if it belonged to us, right?
Yeah, there is this will to create an evergreen artifact, when, if I understand you correctly, music is more of a time capsule, and that's what it should be. It should be something that was created at a point in time by some people somewhere, and it's like a tattoo. You don't change the tattoo every week to make it better and more current. You just have it, and that's it. And it reminds you of stuff.
Yeah. And the more you deepen your connection to this music, or whatever music you're making, the more you deepen it, the more it somehow becomes the more it becomes yours, even if it wasn't yours to begin with, right?
Yeah, it's like working for it gives it some depth.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, that is a very interesting subject to go into. I wonder if you know, I just learned the history of Febreze. I don't know if you know about how Febreze came about. You know Febreze, right?
Febreze, the
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah, the spray
the
thing.
spray. Yes.
Yeah. And some chemists found out about it by accident in a lab.
Okay.
And apparently his wife was always mad at him because he always smelled like cigarette. And on that day he did not smell like cigarette. So she was like, "Oh, you stopped smoking. You didn't smoke today." And she was like, and he was like, What did you talk about? What are you talking about? Of course I smoked. Stop annoying me with that cigarette thing." And then they quickly found that they had found this particle that had the property of sucking odors away when it was drying.
Yeah.
So they were like, "We are sitting on a gold mine." and they started marketing and selling Febreze and giving it to people, but actually it did not sell at all. They could not sell Febreze because it's a property of the human body that if you have bad smells, after like a few minutes of habituation, you don't smell them anymore. So they had to go through the painstaking process of finding a perfume that they could put in Febreze without Febreze destroying the perfume, and then do a marketing campaign so people would make Febrezing. So it basically destroyed the purpose of Febreze. And yeah, and where I'm going with this is that in a certain sense, music, I mean, we live in a pretty in many ways, the society that we live in alienates us. And he tells us that music is something, it's like a product that you can enjoy. But there is something to be said for working to get it. And the more I spend hours working on music, which is a thing that I enjoy, but it's still painstaking, the more my appreciation deepens and the more I can appreciate it. And the parallel with Febreze is there, because how do you explain to someone who doesn't have a sharpened ear the difference between, you know, what? Yeah.
No, that's right. And it takes
I mean, it's like the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah. No, and that's of course. I mean, that's the problem with all the recorded music now. Is that you know most people can't many people are not even aware of whether there are real instruments or real musicians playing on the music that they hear on the radio, and so this only compounds this problem of not realizing the value of the Febreze.
Yeah, but now Febreze stinks.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, when I first came in contact with Febreze, it was just I had an American friend who was, no, maybe not, I forgot, but yeah, when I was in America, some people tended to maniacally put Febreze on everything.
Yeah.
And for me, it smells so chemical, and I was like, why? So the purpose of Febreze has been kind of like annihilated.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. It's not that there is not, any art form, any traditional music. I'm someone who romanticizes so much, like, the harp player sitting on the dirt in Africa somewhere with his, 30 or 40 ancient songs that he can play at some masterful level, and how boring could it have become, or how suffocating could it be to live in an environment where that was music, like that, and like a few different kinds of drumming, and then you hear something else coming from the other village, and that's that we have such a wealth of different things to listen to now, and there's new stuff being invented all the time. One shouldn't discount that, and I sort of do believe that the history of electronic music is also sort of just beginning, that in one sense it's really worth remembering that the synthesizer was invented less than 100 years ago, and we're in this sort of phase right now, sort of like the early stage of cinema or something still, where there's some initial mainstream that has emerged and is sort of there was an initial period of experimentalism. Now we're in this sort of period of like there being a big mainstream, and what comes after that, after people get bored of that, is anybody's guess. Just like right now, I think the guitar is actually in a really interesting stage because we're sort of finally over this whole guitar hero phase of the guitar, Hendrix came, and then there was 30 years of like awful like gymnastics, basically, instrumental gymnastics, trying to top that, and whatever good there may have been in Steve Vai or Eric Johnson or Yngwie Malmsteen or whoever else, and all the metal hair bands and, like that's sort of done. Hip hop and electronic music have displaced that. And now if you look around the world of guitar music, there's, right, how many important bands are there on the radio with guitars right now? Like none. I don't know, Yeah. But if you go around, there's all sorts of fascinating stuff happening with the guitar, and it's being taken in all sorts of different directions. Slide guitar playing has gotten to a level that it has never been at in the past. There's a whole new level of virtuosity that's been achieved.
Like who does that?
I mean, Derek Trucks is only the most obvious mainstream name of a star, who's really synthesized something from Indian music and other traditions on the slide guitar. Bob Brosman passed away a few years ago. I don't know if one should put him on a pedestal, but anyways, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. There's all sorts of microtonal music happening on guitar and it's such a flexible instrument, and we're just and I think that period for electronic music is actually still coming, right? You already see it if you look around. I don't know very much about what's going on, only that surely in all sorts of underground corners, people are doing all sorts of interesting things with electronic music and working very, very hard to create something distinctive and doing the work,
Okay, so are we in the guitar hero phase of electronic music, or no?
I think we are. I think we're in the phase where like some of the main tricks that emerged out of the technology, right? You can create, these hypnotic African style rhythms, and people like to dance to them because they're connected to this, these old things, just like the guitar. Just like when electric guitar music basically took the trick of electric guitar music was to take gospel, English folk music, some European influences, take all this melodic and harmonic structure that came from all these acoustic music traditions and put them, put it on the big stage as loud as possible, right? And whether you have Queen doing it operatically, or the real, the neoclassical shredders, or somebody writing, sort of almost medieval sounding melodies like some of Nirvana's music, like this is what that was, and now there's more. Now to be original, you have to work harder, right? There's all of that's been done, and we need to work harder and keep pushing it forward.
Even though the niche, but now it's probably a niche. It's not in the mainstream anymore. But of guitar heroes is stronger than ever, and it's like harder, faster, stronger. And there's been like an enormous controversy recently. I don't know if you know about that. Probably not. but the Instagram controversy of guitar players speeding up their playing, and everybody's talking about it. And I feel like that, and like the whole Instagram format of musicians in general, it gives me, I feel like I can understand what it feels a little bit, of course, to a lesser degree, but I can feel what it is like to be a 13-year-old or like a 20-year-old woman on Instagram and seeing all these manipulated pictures of models and feeling bad about myself because I'm like, wow. And you see, you just scroll and you see hundreds of videos of people who play in a way that is inhumanly good, and that has a tendency to crush your ego if you don't keep it in check.
I guess this is why I'm not on Instagram.
Yeah. But you heard of it?
No, I hadn't even heard of this problem. I mean, of course, I've periodically some video of some, some 14-year-old from somewhere shredding something makes it my way.
Okay.
And yeah, I just. And I know, of course, that within the world of guitar, there's a subculture, and guitar is a huge, it's a huge marketing thing, and there are the magazines and the stores and everything, and of course there are guitar specific artists and niches as there is everything. Yeah, 30 years ago, that was much more like
in the mainstream,
in the mainstream. And a lot of that music has not aged very well. Just like I think a lot of the techno that we're listening to now is not going to age very well because a lot of it is a copy of an idea. Right? If you go back to Aphex Twin or the Prodigy or the Chemical Brothers, I don't know, or some people back in Detroit, I know nothing about electronic music. Don't ask me, right? But there were some good ideas that provided the template for 30 years of imitation, as Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin provided the template for 30 years of imitation as well.
Yeah.
And now it's like if you try to play guitar like Jimi Hendrix now, you basically will, you're either in some sort of funny little side circuit of like historical reenactment, basically. Otherwise, you're not, it's weird to want to sound like Hendrix now, right?
You're milking a dead cow.
Yeah.
That's a very bad image. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were mentioning a bit earlier, just this like fundamental attribution error, and I wanted to ask you because you mentioned Freddie Mercury and Queen, and I don't know if you saw this movie Bohemian Rhapsody, but I feel like I wanted to ask you, where do you think this tendency to deify artists comes from? Because as you said, it's more of a genius than a genius, and everybody comes from somewhere, and that movie is basically a revisionist history of Queen, and I mean, this is completely unhistorical. If you look at what happened in Queen and what happens in the movie, it is completely off. Like the band never broke up. Freddie Mercury did not know he had AIDS before that 1996 charity concert. Everything is spun in a way, and I feel like that participates in a wider idea of deifying performers and making them more than human. I wonder what you think about that.
I mean, my thinking on this is very influenced by a key passage from Karl Ove Knausgaard's novel, My Struggle, where he basically says that going back to the 19th century and the birth of Romanticism, as we became more and more pressured to live together in cities, our individuality became more and more. There was simultaneously the birth of this romantic notion of the individual, right? Up until that moment, maybe some aristocrats could think of themselves as individuals, but peasants and most people did not have. That you were born into your station in life, and you carried on the work of your family or whatever, right? And this all started to change, and as this romanticized notion of the individual became more and more prominent, it ran into the problem of sameness, right? That of living in a city surrounded by millions of people, you are going to meet your double. You're going to meet other people who do something very similar to you. You can go on Instagram and see all sorts of people who are doing almost the same thing that you're doing better, right? And so our very notion, this very notion that that's at the core of what we believe, is the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of the good life. This idea of finding our voice and finding our what our calling is, and is actually directly contradicted by the experience and the numbers, and this is only made worse by the internet, right? Because it's now not that you don't have to like randomly show up at the show of the other saxophone player who sounds an awful lot like you do, right? You can go find him online very easily, right? And so then what do we do to compensate for this? We put on a pedestal as much as possible and try to preserve this idea of the original genius. It becomes, this is our mental fetish that blocks out this idea of the sameness that is underneath everything. And again, if we want to bring that person down or make fun of them, all we have to do is parody them or reveal that they actually stole their ideas for someone else. And this gets at the taboo. This gets at this taboo in our culture that we might actually we actually are all a product of our surroundings, and we're all Scenius derived.
Yeah, and there is no shame in that. I would like to tie this, maybe try to tie this to the idea of mimetic desire by René Girard. I don't know if you know him, but I feel like I'm just starting to break from the chains of mimetic desire in the music scene, because not only there is a homogeneity of like the music we create, but there is also a homogenization of desire, and we all come, if desire is something that we get from the atmosphere of where we're living in and from our peers and etc., and if we learn what to desire, playing guitar faster, or all that stuff, then it can derail us and makes us like pursue things that we would not really have pursued in the first place, just because there is this whole mechanism of pushing. You know what I mean?
I think it's absolutely there, and it's not easy. It's not easy to disentangle mimetic desire from some deeper calling that you feel that has to do also with mimesis. Somehow it's like a calling, if we want to believe in this word, would be some connection that one feels, some voice inside, something you discover that it feels really, really good to you to do a certain thing, right? And as you keep doing this thing, it feeds you in some way. And maybe maybe that's somehow maybe that's a useful distinction between purely mimetic desire and like the loving, the imitate, the like learning from a teacher out of love, right? Mimetic desire is like, I feel competition, or I feel I want the success that person has, or I want to be able to play as fast as that person, or I want it can maybe never be satisfied, and is bound to be replaced by other desires, or as soon as you get it, you want something else, right? Whereas if you fall in love in a deeper way with something, it's more of a nurturing relationship rather than a consuming relationship, right? You wanna, if you fall in love with the tradition of African music, or the tradition of, the bebop saxophone or something like that, it's not about then playing faster than the other bebop saxophone player, only to then discover that there's someone else who can play even faster, does even better. It's more like, how can I nourish this part of myself and this thing out in the world in a way that makes it grow? And then it's not a competitive thing anymore. It's something you're doing out of love.
Okay, well, thank you for the super interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But yeah, that was a ton of interesting information, and that just gives me 101 ideas of where we could go next with that. But well, we'll have to wait for that. So, Nick Morrison, thank you a lot for giving this the time and for being here. And yeah, thanks. Have a nice day.
A pleasure talking to you, Baptiste.
So that's that. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To be honest, I could have gone for 2 more hours. I would have loved to go into other things he's passionate about, like African music, active listening, talking about the idea of harmonic rhythm, on multi-instrumentalism and how it matters, and also obviously about his music that we barely talked about, his solo music, his playing in bands, etc. So I hope we'll have an opportunity at some other point to go into all of that. But that's it for now, and yes, I hope you enjoyed the conversation and you learned something. Okay, and now footnotes. All the links I'm going to talk about, you can find them in the description of the YouTube version of this podcast. So, footnote number 1, The Velvet Lounge, the AACM, and the book about Coltrane by Ben Ratliff. You have links to all of this in the description. Footnote number 2, Anthony Braxton, Roscoe Mitchell, and the Heart Ensemble of Chicago. Same, you have links down there if you want to explore these people some more. Footnote number 3, Vincent Davis and Edward Wilkerson. Same thing, links below if you want to learn more about these persons. Footnote number 4, the question of the symbol, was it Charles Mingus or Charlie Parker? So I was wrong on this one. Nick said that Charlie Parker had a symbol thrown at him, and it's true that in 1937, when he was 16 years old, he got a symbol thrown at his feet by Joe Jones, the drummer of Count Basie's orchestra. And what I thought I knew and what I was referring to is the fact that Mingus punched a trombonist in the face and broke his teeth in 1962, Jimmy Kepner. Footnote number 5, U2 and the Claw. I put a link in the description, but I'm going to tell you a bit more about the U2 360 Degrees tour. That was a tour that was held by the band between 2009 and 2011 in support of their 2009 album No Line on the Horizon. And they had a circular stage in the middle of the stadiums in which they were playing with a gigantic structure nicknamed the Claw, which was 50 meters tall and which is to this day the largest stage ever constructed. And it was this tour was a financial success because for many reasons, but also because it made possible to increase the attendance in stadiums because the structure was in the middle of the stadium. Footnote number 6, the copyright documentary I was telling about. There's a link in description and the name of it is Copyright Criminals. Footnote number 7, Larry Lessig. So Larry Lessig is a very interesting character and lawyer. He's very iconoclastic in his ideas. He's a professor at the Stanford Law School and he's the founder of the Creative Commons license. Very interesting person. And the TED Talk I was talking about is the old one called Laws That Choke Creativity. But he also has other TED Talks that I would recommend you check out. Footnote number 8, Henkes Netsky. I put a link in description. Henkes was Nick's teacher. He's a multi-instrumentalist composer and ethnomusicologist, and he chairs the contemporary improvisation department at NEC, the New England Conservatory. He founded the Klezmer Conservatory Band, which is a world-famous Yiddish music ensemble, and he serves as the research director of the Klezmer Conservatory of the Klezmer Conservatory Foundation, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to the preservation and perpetuation of traditional Eastern European Jewish music. So I took that from Wikipedia, but you are welcome to go listen to his music and learn more about the person. Footnote number 9, Ran Blake. Ran Blake is an American pianist, composer, and educator. He is known for his unique style that combines blues, gospel, classical, and film noir influences into an innovative and dark jazz sound. He started the Department of Third Stream, which is now called the Department of Contemporary Improvisation at NEC, with Gunther Schuller, and we mentioned that in the talk. He wrote a book called Primacy of the Ear, which was suggested to me by Nick and which I read. It's a very short book and extremely interesting. The whole point of it is to put the ear back at the center of musical training and as a means to develop a personal musical style. So it's a very eye-opening, or should I say ear-opening book that I would recommend you check out. Footnote number 10, Joe Morris. He's an American free jazz guitar player. There is a link in the description if you want to learn more about him, and he was also Nick's teacher. Footnote number 11, Tess Ullmann. Tess Ullmann is a German musician and author, and he's a founding member of the indie pop band Tomte. He's also famous in Germany for his solo career. Footnote number 12, the idea of Scenius. So in the description, you can find a link to the video in which Brian Eno describes his idea of Scenius. Number 13, Febreze and Charles Duhigg's Power of Habit. So I just wanted to credit Charles Duhigg's books, The Power of Habit, because that's where I got the Febreze anecdote from. And I also give you a link of a talk he gave that is extremely interesting and somewhat irrelevant to the talk we were having, but still interesting. Footnote number 14, Derek Trucks and Bob Brosman. Below you can find 2 links to their respective music. Footnote number 15, the Live Aid Queen concert and fact-checking Bohemian Rhapsody. So the concert took place in 1985 on the 13th of July and not in 86, as I said. And I also linked below a Rolling Stone article where they go through all that was not historical in the Bohemian Rhapsody movie. Footnote number 16. Karl Ove Knausgård is a Norwegian author, and I give you a link to learn more about him below if you're interested. And finally, footnote number 17. René Girard, or René Girard, was a French historian, literary critic and philosopher, extremely interesting thinker. He's really famous for the idea of mimetic desire, to which I refer, and to the idea of scapegoat mechanism. There is a link below if you want to learn more about him. Well, people, that was it. Episode number 4 of the Cross-Pollination podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you learned something. Thank you for your support. That was Baptiste Vattiès for the Cross-Pollination podcast, and that's all for now.